District. I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's town hall on the dangers of fentanyl and its impact on our youth and community. We also want to welcome our school board members, President Christy Dawson and Brian Swanson, our superintendent, Dr. Ralph Porras, and we want to say thank you to our partners here in attendance from PGUSD, Carmel, and as well as our local law enforcement who are here virtually this evening. Our presenters, Dr. Reb Close and Dr. Casey Grover, are emergency department doctors at Community Hospital of the Monterey Peninsula. They're also the leaders of Prescribe Safe, a partnership between Montage Health, Community Hospital of the Monterey Peninsula, and 30 other local organizations to reduce opioid abuse and misuse. Dr. Close and Dr. Grover are committed to working with the community to reduce overdoses, improve access to addiction treatment, and increase drug abuse prevention. Should anybody have any questions for Dr. Close or Dr. Grover, and if you're online virtually, please put them in the chat and we will provide time at the end of the presentation for discussion. You see, if you're here in person, you have an index card and a pen on several chairs. Should you have a question, please write them down and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. We also have a special guest from Carmel, a parent who's lived firsthand experience with the dangers of fentanyl, and she's going to be a special guest to our presenters tonight, Michelle Henderson. Thank you very much for being here. All right, without further ado, I'd like to begin.
So first of all, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone who's joining us virtually. Thank you for PG for hosting us and for asking us to help share what we're experiencing and how we as a community can come together to do what we can to change the trajectory that we are currently on. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you. To introduce myself, I'm Reb Close, as was mentioned, an emergency physician. I'm also training for my board certification in addiction medicine. And then we've been working with our Monterey County Prescribe Safe initiative for almost 10 years,
almost 10.
8 years now, as we've really had to change to the environment as it happens. We've had to respond to the need. We've been able to do that. And that's actually what brings us here today. Introduce yourself, Casey.
Yep, Casey. So sorry, we both have not very gender specific names. Reb, Casey. So yes, actually apologize for the echo. Oh, they move. Is that better? No echo? Okay. I grew up in this area. My dad used to coach football at PG High. Some of my earliest memories are on the football field at this high school just down the road. But yes, we're also married. I always have to give, we used to have to give that disclosure that we're married. So if we make a joke, keep going, keep trying. Sorry. Are we doing okay? Okay. So if we make a joke, it's because we're married. So for what it is, if we can start some slides, that would be great. And I have to say, this feels a little informal with like us in this like big desk up here. We'll try to keep it as kind of intimate as possible. But yeah, I have to give credit to Reb. There was a case of a 19-month-old that came to our emergency department at CHOMP with an opioid overdose. And that really started everything. We began to realize just what a bad problem this was. And a lot of what you're going to hear represents nearly a decade of work trying to understand the problem and how to come up with some solutions. All right, if we want to go to the next slide, that would be great.
So the first thing I want to mention is we're going to talk about some really challenging stuff. There's going to be images of drugs and paraphernalia, and I would ask that you attend to your own needs. This could be triggering for some people and frightening, to be honest. And so I'm just asking that you attend to your needs, and whatever you need to do to take care of yourself during this session, I would ask that you do that. And so the first thing we wanted to do was to actually show the video that we put together about fentanyl, that we put it together for Monterey Unified. For PGUSD, we put this together as just a way to get the message to our community and specifically to our youth.
So not that one, that's the other one. That's the Narcan training video. Yep. These pills are increasingly contaminated with, looks like, yep.
So fentanyl is one of the chemicals in our street drugs right now that is lethal, that is killing people.
Fake pills and drugs being sold are everywhere. What we're seeing is that these pills are increasingly contaminated with either fentanyl, which is a very potent opioid which can cause an overdose, or other substances or mixes of fentanyl and other substances.
And the reason it in particular is so deadly is because of its potency. Fentanyl is a few granules. Is like a chocolate chip cookie with walnuts. When you look at that cookie, you see the chocolate chips and you see the walnuts. But what if someone put basically a chocolate glaze over the whole thing? And when you're looking at that single pill that looks like Xanax or looks like a Percocet, you can't see through that coating. Essentially, slipping something into your drink, every single pill. They numb so heavily that the pain of suffocation isn't sensed by the body.
Fentanyl is only the tip of the iceberg. We are seeing dozens of new chemicals every year in our drug supply, many of which we're having to educate our doctors about because they've never heard of them. What that means is there are so many pills being sold that sometimes you might find them where you don't even expect them, like a friend. The pills being sold in our schools, the pills that a friend might give you, the powders that a friend might say is no big deal if you snort it. It's all so dangerous that we're seeing people overdose the first time they try a drug, a pill, a powder, anything. Start today thinking about what you're going to say. And if you don't have a plan for what you're going to say, you may end up saying yes. There's quite a bit of duplicity, if you will, between what was in that and what we're going to present. So I'm assuming, David, it's okay if we share that with this group, like in the chat, if folks want to look at it. Okay, sorry, it's within PGUSD, so you have to use approval. All right, let's go on to the next slide.
What I would ask as well with the video, when you have access to
one
it,
of my
share it with your
earliest
families.
memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives being able to.
Oh, that's.
And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family.
No, that's okay. It's actually, what is his name?
I've been thinking about it a lot lately.
Chasing the Screen, Johan Hari.
Now,
he's an author
exactly
that writes about
100
addiction.
years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed.
Sorry, he has a very distinct voice. I apologize.
We're back. Okay, so when we started trying to address what we were seeing in our emergency room and in our community was well above the state average for overdoses. And as you can see by this graphic, in 2013, 2014, we had a big problem compared to the state and just in general. And so we really tried to do a lot of outreach. We tried to do education. We were talking to doctors. We were talking to patients and family members and trying to let people know the dangers of prescription pills at the time, because that's what we were mainly dealing with. And we made some really significant changes. And then in October of 2019, fentanyl came to our community. And as you can see, fentanyl isn't just in our community, it's across the state, across the nation. And you can see that trend, the orange line of California. They actually had to change the y-axis of this graphic to be able to show what's going on. And then you can see Monterey has been following that, unfortunately. And people ask, oh, can you go to the next slide? I'm sorry. People ask me all the time, where are the overdoses happening? What's happening? Well, I track the overdoses in our community. It's everywhere. As you can see, we actually put stars for our high schools so we can see how this is impacting our neighborhoods. And if you ask, where is this happening? Next slide, please. It's all over the county. And I've had people say to me, oh, this isn't in my neighborhood. This isn't my problem. It is. I promise you. It's everywhere. And so we need to understand that and respect that. People have said to me, and literally people in healthcare professions have said to me, oh, I don't need to have Narcan. I don't have that problem. I'm like, you have neighbors. You go to public places to buy food. You need Narcan. You need to be able to save a life. And we'll talk about Narcan, and then we actually are able to distribute it here tonight. Next slide, please.
So, people always ask, my time is very valuable. Why should I spend my time learning about this particular topic? So I'm going to ask you kind of, why are we here tonight? And there's 172 people on Zoom. So it's a pretty big group. And we've really seen kind of a change really unlike anything else I've seen in healthcare of what's happening in our community when it comes to overdoses. And fentanyl arrived in our community in 2019, there was one weekend in October that we've actually called, kind of nicknamed Fentanyl Weekend, where we were actually out of town and we got on our cell phone 10 different notifications from our colleagues in the CHOMP emergency department that there was something weird and it was causing overdoses, and it ended up being fentanyl. Now, fentanyl is actually a very useful medicine. I worked a shift last Friday and I gave it to somebody with a kidney stone. It's very useful when it's dosed correctly. And you will hopefully be experts in fentanyl dosing after we get through this. And you'll understand just how the dosing makes the difference and why it's so dangerous. And the other thing, unfortunately, is that you'll also learn just kind of how the drug market is changing. I mean, I think, I'm 38. When I was a kid, I always thought of drugs in like other places or in back alleys or in big cities. And it's on the internet. It's on social media. You can order this stuff online. And it's just unbelievable how that market has really changed. And it's our youth are so vulnerable. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, fentanyl is an opioid. It is a painkiller. So if somebody breaks a bone and they're in severe pain, we can use various types of medications, and opioid is one of them. I had shoulder surgery in August, and my surgeon gave me a number of different options for pain, one of which was an opioid. I tried to use it as little as possible, and I did most of my pain relief with things like Tylenol and ibuprofen and ice. But sometimes life hurts. We got a text message from a friend who just had surgery today. He's in a lot of pain. And so it's important to realize that opioids are not all bad, and they have use in the proper medical setting. Fentanyl specifically is very potent. It's very strong. Most people are familiar with morphine. It's a common name that people recognize. Morphine is something we use around the hospital when it's appropriate. And fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine. If you go on to the next slide, please. And you can see there in that graphic in green, the far left is a vial with the lethal dose of heroin in an adult. In the middle, that's fentanyl. That's the lethal dose of fentanyl in an adult. And on the far right, that's called carfentanil. That's a fentanyl derivative that is not medically used, or at least not in the US. And that's the lethal dose in an adult. And that's a single grain. I'm going to give you an example of kind of what those powders look like. So this is a packet of sugar, and it weighs 2.83 grams. Okay. So if you took this much fentanyl, 2.8 grams of fentanyl, that's 28,000 doses. That would provide a therapeutic dose and 1,400 fatalities in this sugar packet. So if you're looking at the size of that vial is only about 2 inches tall. And so people are, trying to figure out like, well, how is it getting smuggled? Like if you want to make fake pills, there's 28,000's worth right there. So this is one of the reasons why it's such a unique and different problem is, cannabis, when it was illegal, it was in these big bricks. It was hard to smuggle, but this is just so potent and so therefore easy to smuggle and hide. But as you can imagine, if you're making drugs that are to be sold on the street as counterfeit, if you miss a grain, you go from a pill that wouldn't kill someone to a potentially fatal tablet. And that's really what we're seeing. And that's why it's so hard.
And then explaining the other photos, I was working at one of our syringe exchanges, and we actually asked someone if they wanted us to test their product. We have a device up at CHOMP that you can actually use. It's a mass spectrometer, and you can use it to determine what's in a substance. And they brought to me the substance that's up in that left upper corner. It's supposed to be black char heroin. And the reason I show that with the chocolate chip cookie below is the analogy that I made when I was making that video is you see the chocolate chips. Well, if you look really closely at the heroin, there's those white speckles. That's all it takes. And so just realizing how potent it is and how you can easily put in the wrong number of granules and end up with a fatal overdose. So that's the point of the analogy here is you don't know if each of those granules were representing the chocolate chip, which part of the cookie has those, right? We actually had a group of 4 young people that realized the potency and were concerned about the potency of the pill that they were about to use. And so they quartered it. One of those youth had a near fatal overdose. Fortunately, they did not suffer a fatal overdose. 2 of those youths had the desired effect, and the other had essentially nothing. So which part of the pill is the part that's the lethal part? And that's what we never know.
And again, it just goes back that visualization of just how little fentanyl makes a difference in feeling something to having a fatal overdose. This is why this problem is so unique and challenging. Next slide, please. So one thing that people ask is, why would you sell fentanyl if you are a dealer, if you're killing people who you're selling to? And it's a lot of it, unfortunately, is kind of supply and demand and how the brain with addiction works. So the first thing is traditional drugs are grown, right? Heroin is from the opium poppy. Cocaine is from the coca plant. Those are all grown. Fentanyl is made in a lab, meaning you don't have the same labor requirements. If there's weather changes, it doesn't matter. Nobody can cut down your crops. It's synthetic. And a lot of these precursor chemicals, to make fentanyl are sold as legal research chemicals. Additionally, there's a phenomenon called the Iron Law of Prohibition, which is that if you make a substance illegal, people will make it more potent and able to, in order to smuggle it. And we saw this in Prohibition in the United States in the 30s, right? People used to drink beer and wine. We made them illegal, and so they drank whiskey and moonshine. It was easier to smuggle. After Prohibition ended, there was a regression back to the less potent form, being wine and beer. And so because this sugar packet, like we talked about, it's so potent, you can send this through the US mail. So it turns out that the US Postal Service is doing a lot of the distribution unwittingly of these fentanyl products. And it's a single letter. You can mail up to, I think, 112 grams in a letter. I mean, it's so hard to detect when you're mailing it. And additionally, it's because it's made in a lab, it's cheap. And therefore, if you order 10 packages and 8 get confiscated, it just takes one sugar packet to make 28,000 doses. It's just so easy for the folks getting the fentanyl to turn it into pills to be sold on the street. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, also, the way the brain works with addiction is, I always joke, if you told me there's bad mayonnaise at Safeway, I'm not going to Safeway to buy bad mayonnaise. I know it's bad mayonnaise. The way the addicted brain works is when someone is truly addicted and they're either having a very strong craving or they're in withdrawal, the brain regresses, and the front part of the brain that makes decisions, the prefrontal cortex, is outweighed by the back parts of the brain, the fight or flight response. So when somebody is really addicted, they lose the ability to make the rational decisions. Like I sometimes ask my patients, why would you do that? And the answer is because the brain is not functioning correctly. It seeks the drug as the ultimate, almost like fight or flight survival, or it kind of puts it at that weight in decision making. And so people who are addicted seek the most intense drug because that's how their brain chemistry is working. It's very sad that they're the victims in this because you have someone dealing something ultra potent and their brains are telling them to go get it, even though they know the risks. And then the last thing is that fentanyl is unfortunately very versatile. Next slide, please. So we're talking here today because fentanyl is unfortunately killing people. And it's killing them, it's causing overdoses. And what an overdose is, it's just what it sounds like. A person takes more of whatever it is than they're supposed to, and it causes some sort of adverse health effect. You can overdose on many different things. Opioids specifically cause the breathing to stop. Kind of the way I think of it is when you hold your breath, you have that painful urge to breathe. Opioids take away that painful urge to breathe. So what will happen is a person who has an opioid overdose will get very sleepy. They'll essentially fall asleep. And then while they're asleep, they stop breathing. And fentanyl, because it's so potent, causes it at lower amounts than really any other opioid. And so that's, again, why this is such a big deal, is you have an ultra potent drug that people don't know how much is and what they're taking, and it's easy to cause an overdose, particularly a fatal overdose. Next slide, please.
And so people ask me all the time, what does it look like when someone is having an overdose, or what I'm really considering a fentanyl poisoning?
Right.
And we'll talk more about that. But it's that decreased responsiveness. You try to wake someone up and they won't wake up. You call their name, you rub their chest, you yell at them. Some people, we see it and hear about it, they slap somebody to try to wake them up. There's no response. So that's the first thing. You will note that there is slowed breathing or no breathing. That's what we watch for as medical providers. You see that the breathing rate is 2, if that, in a minute. And so that's something to watch for. So we say unresponsiveness, confusion, sleepiness. It's really that you cannot get the person to respond to you. Something that's been mentioned is the pinpoint or the tiny pupils, truly, I don't expect anyone in that situation to be looking at pupils. I've got to be honest with you. If somebody's not responding to you, it's time to presume it's an overdose or a potential poisoning of fentanyl and to react to that. If someone is using methamphetamines and that methamphetamine is contaminated with fentanyl, which is what we see, the pupils can be all over the place. So number one, I don't expect anybody to be looking at pupils on the street of a family member, of a friend, of a bystander. I don't expect any of that. But I do want to have you guys hear that is because it's something that is talked about, but I would not expect anyone to look specifically.
Yeah, next slide, please.
So how is a poisoning or an overdose treated? And fortunately, we have been able to obtain naloxone or Narcan, and that is the medication used to reverse an overdose. And how it works is if you've got your receptor, your opiate receptor, and you have fentanyl sitting on it, fortunately, Narcan or naloxone is strong enough to displace that fentanyl and then to bind to that receptor and block it from being activated again by fentanyl. And when it binds, it doesn't activate the receptor to cause a further poisoning or an overdose. It just displaces and it blocks it from any further use, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the analogy we've used sometimes, it's like a lock and a key. In your brain, you have a lock and the opioid molecule fits in like a key. The naloxone is like a dummy key, so that no further opioids can have any effect. Just want to clarify, because this comes up all the time. We're going to teach tonight about a brand called Narcan, like Tylenol is a brand. Acetaminophen is the generic. The generic is called naloxone. So sometimes you'll hear both Narcan or naloxone. And then one thing I do want to mention, when someone has an overdose, it is time sensitive. And so you have really 5 minutes to give a person a dose to fully wake them up. You have up to about 8 minutes before they'll start to go into cardiac arrest. And in between 5 and 8 minutes, you may get some brain damage. So I'll share a story from a friend of mine who died of an overdose. And his story was that he went almost 8 minutes without breathing after an opiate overdose. So we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. And actually, this is his art. This is my friend Paul. He died of an opioid overdose, or actually a mixed overdose in 2019. But this is what he painted life was like living with addiction. And Paul was a very, very, very nice man. He grew up in the area, grew up locally, went to one of our local high schools, has a really nice family. And yet, due to very, very unfortunate life circumstances, ended up developing a severe substance use disorder. And when I gave his eulogy, I promised his family I would teach with his story. So every presentation we give, we always pay respect. So, and then Paul, as I mentioned, had an overdose and went between 5 and 8 minutes without breathing. And he noticed a big difference afterwards. He couldn't hold a job afterwards. He was very impulsive. And so the goal is, and we were talking about where to put this drug on campus. If there's an overdose, is to get the dose in somebody as fast as possible, because you can make sure they don't have a cardiac arrest where their heart stops, and also you can protect their brain. Next slide, please. I think this is the second video. Yep. I think that's just our slide, unfortunately. So this is a training video. We have to give kudos to Montage Health for putting this together, but this is our training video, after which you will be prepared on how to give a dose of this antidote.
And you'll have access
I'm
to
Dr.
this video
Casey
to share with
Grover.
friends
I'm
and
one of
family.
the emergency physicians at Community Hospital of the Monterey Peninsula. I am also soon to be board certified in addiction medicine. I am also one of the lead physicians for the Monterey County Prescribe Safe Initiative.
And I'm Dr. Reb Close, also an emergency physician at Community Hospital of the Monterey Peninsula. I as well will be getting my addiction medicine board certification, and I am one of the lead clinical physicians for our Monterey County Prescribe Safe Initiative.
You might be asking why we're here today.
We are here today because America lost 93,000 people to overdose last year. That is 10 deaths per hour, and almost 70,000 of those were related to opioids.
Today, we'll be discussing how to actually use naloxone to rescue someone from an opiate overdose. And we will be talking about the nasal spray called nasal Narcan. There are basically 5 steps to saving someone's life. You want to protect yourself, make sure that it's safe where you're going to rescue a person. You want to call the paramedics, call 911 for help. You want to open up the package and get the nasal spray ready. You want to place the device into the victim's nose, and then you want to push the plunger. So those are 5 Ps. Protect yourself, paramedics, open the package, put it in the nose, push the plunger.
All right, so now what we would like to do is to simulate a potential overdose situation so you can see how I would respond in this type of a scenario. So the first P was protect yourself, and as is evident with what we hear when we get on a plane, put on your own face mask first before you put on someone else's. So at least make sure the scene is safe. If you're in traffic and trying to respond to an overdose, that's a more dangerous situation for both of you. So there may be pills on scene, there may be sharps or needles on scene, capped or uncapped. Just please make sure that you are safe so you can actually attend to someone who's potentially overdosed. So as you're on scene, and truly even as you're approaching, activate 911. We need to have our paramedics and our first responders on scene as quickly as possible. They may need to bring more supplies and Narcan. You don't know what you're up against yet, and so you need that medical backup. So calling 911, that is our second P, and it may even be considered the first P, paramedics. Okay, so the next P is to open the package and prepare to give a dose. You've made sure things are safe, you've got 911 on their way, but our next part is to open up the package, and inside each package there are 2 doses of naloxone. You take out one of those doses, you open the blister pack, okay, and then you're ready to go. You put your finger on each side and your thumb on the plunger, and you're ready to administer your dose. So you've got your naloxone, you've got it in your hand, you've got your 2 fingers on the side of the tip, and your thumb is on the plunger in the bottom. You next place it in the person's nose, and you place it until your fingers are basically touching their nose. And that's the fourth P, is place it in the person's nose. The last step in this is to push the plunger, and that's it. So the way you know you've used a dose is that plunger has pushed up, it doesn't come back down. And when you administer the dose, don't go slowly, push the dose, it goes in all at one time. Then you want to make sure that your victim is still safe. Hopefully you'll see that they're going to start having an improvement in their mental status or in their breathing. But if not, you've got to be ready to go with the second dose that's in your package. Okay, that's why there are 2, is you will probably need both in our current situation with the drugs that are on our street right now. So when you do that, you open the next dose, okay? You take it out, prepare it the same way. What you want to think about is using it in the other nostril. And so you go in, you put it in until your fingers touch their nose, and push that second dose. And this dose, as you can see, has been used, and now you've administered both doses that were in your Narcan box, and 911 should be arriving about this time. So giving it to someone who's upright, say Casey is slumped over, right? If he's overdosed in a chair and he's slumped over, I put it in the nose, put it until my fingers are flush with his nose, and then administer the dose.
There are 2 other important things to remember when using a dose of the nasal naloxone, also known as nasal Narcan. The first is that it can be given when a person is upright or when a person is not breathing, as it's actually absorbed through the fleshy part of the nose, and it does not require the person to be breathing to be effective. The other thing is I got 3 doses of real medication in this video, and as you saw, it's not caused any problems. So if you are wrong and you give it to somebody who is not having an overdose, you will not cause them any harm. If you're wondering when you might need to give a dose of the nasal naloxone, it would be when you suspect a person has had an opiate overdose. What that can look like is that a person would be unresponsive, they might have shallow breathing, or not even be breathing at all. You'd want to give a dose of this medication, as Dr. Close demonstrated, if you suspect that a person could be having an overdose, such as a person who is unresponsive or poorly breathing. And as we saw from me receiving multiple doses, if you're wrong, giving a dose to someone will not cause any harm. As long as you call 911 and paramedics are on the way, they'll get the treatment that they need.
You may be concerned that when you're on the scene of an overdose, that if you call 911, you may get in trouble with local law enforcement. There is a law, a California law, called the Good Samaritan Law that protects people from legal consequences when they call 911 on behalf of someone who's overdosed.
There are many formulations of this medication we talked about today called naloxone, and today we reviewed the specific one called nasal Narcan. Montage Health has a great website, montagehealth.org. And if you search on it, you can search for our county coalition called Prescribe Safe. It has lots of treatment resources, as well as information on how to use the other forms of naloxone. We want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you in advance for saving a life. All right, we can go back to the slide deck. And yes, that's absolutely true. I did get 3 doses of Narcan in that video.
Yeah. We've each had a number of them over the years. Probably we'll have a couple tonight in showing you guys how to use it. People have asked me, what if someone's having a heart attack and I give them Narcan? They're still having a heart attack and you tried to save their lives and the paramedics are on their way.
And that's
you can't go wrong.
Say that's the reason we always call 911 is if you're wrong, at least they're going to get taken up to the hospital and then the paramedics will do what they otherwise do. And then the other thing is that some of our opioids last longer than the Narcan. So we don't know what's on the street. And so if people can actually re-overdose, if you will, if they take something that lasts, say, 12 hours, the Narcan only lasts like 45 minutes. So they will essentially re-overdose. So at the hospital, we will observe them for a certain period of time. And only if they show that they're not showing those signs of a re-overdose, if you will we know that they're safe for discharge.
So we get asked all the time, where do we get Narcan? And first and foremost, those of you that are here, you've been trained now, and I will be giving you a dose. So you have it, truly, we have it in our car, we have it in our work bags. I mean, we were driving home from one of our daughter's classes and someone was slumped over at the side of the road. Glad I had Narcan with me. You know, there's no place not to have it, just like a fire extinguisher.
Right.
So you can get it from your doctor if you prefer as well, or for those that are online, your physician can give you a prescription. The pharmacies can also distribute without a prescription. Not all of them are able to, so call it in advance and make sure, but the pharmacies, you do not need a prescription for this. We also have a list here in the Tri-County area of everyone that stocks Narcan to be given to the public. It's free of charge, of course. And then a distribution event. We have one coming up at the Odomeyer Center.
I don't think we planned it yet.
The date isn't planned yet. We have it on the calendar to plan. But, free distribution events are also an option. And recently, one of our community members ordered it online, came in the mail to their home. And so that is another option as well. And that's the website that's listed. The nation is running low on Narcan, to be honest. The Department of Healthcare Services is trying to figure out where the Narcan is going because they're sending it to the areas of greatest need. So what I noted today when I looked on the website is they were asking people to try their local resources first. And if they were unable, then they would send it to them through the mail.
Next slide, please. All right, we're going to try to push through the slides so we have time to answer questions. So what does fentanyl look like? These are some pictures of some local and some kind of from national resources. So the upper left, fentanyl is generally a white powder. However, it can be cut and mixed in many different ways. In the middle, that's a fake Xanax bar. Xanax is a medication that people think of as for anxiety, and it's very popular in high school. And there were several deaths in Santa Cruz County and also in Monterey County related to people buying Xanax. That's actually not, it's fentanyl. On the upper right, those are a circular blue tablet. That's also fentanyl. In the lower left, a pink powder that's been cut with something that's also fentanyl. I have had some law enforcement colleagues text me photos that they find fentanyl vials. So it's also possible to divert out of the kind of the medical establishment. And then on the lower right, that's probably our most common. Those are called M30s. They're blue. They vary in shade. Salinas police just seized 65,000 of those in Salinas in January. It seems to be kind of batch dependent as to what the effects are. I had one person recently who came in and had been using ones that were a light blue, and she got a different dealer and they were dark blue and they behave differently. But really anything that's blue and round and says M30 on it is essentially known to be fentanyl. Although we've also even had cases where it's not fentanyl, it's something else, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we love to do is partner with law enforcement, just because it's such a different set of resources and approaches to problems. So we were hanging out with a number of our law enforcement colleagues after one of our these sorts of events, and we were talking to a Drug Enforcement Administration officer, and I said, "Why don't you just give us a a picture of all of the fake pills, and then we'll just give it out to everybody and they'll know what to look for. And he says to me, he goes, Casey, for every legitimate pill, you bet there's a counterfeit. And it's unfortunately so true. I mean, people can buy pill presses on the web. They can make their own pills. It's unfortunately so easy with how the internet has changed kind of commerce. Kind of what our message is, unless you get it from a pharmacy, you can assume it's counterfeit. And in this county, if it's counterfeit, you can assume it's fentanyl. And unfortunately, people feel like they know their dealer or they know their friend, like, oh, my friend said it was from Rite Aid. We've seen those cases in our emergency department. And what's even weirder is people are mixing in fentanyl because it's so cheap and easy to smuggle into other drugs. People are buying a stimulant like cocaine or methamphetamine that's an upper, and they get fentanyl very unexpectedly. So it's really kind of throughout the illicit drug market. So again, assume if you buy anything on the street that it's got fentanyl in it. Next slide, please.
So another thing is people ask us oftentimes, well, how would I know? What would I look for in my home or with my family members and friends? And this is some of what is typically called drug paraphernalia. So if you're seeing the foil is really commonly used right now, foil, and you smoke the substance off of it. And so you may find, obviously up in the left upper corner, that's paraphernalia associated with injection drug use. In the middle upper is a pipe that is used to smoke substances. Off to the right is the foil I just mentioned. There's another pipe in the left lower corner. You may find small baggies of powders, crystals, pink powders is a new one we're seeing right now, and then cut straws for snorting. So if you're seeing those kinds of things for your friends and family, it's time to ask. And we'll get to that in a minute.
And just to understand what the foil or the spoon actually is usually the pill is either mixed with water and then heated in a spoon or on foil. And then when they're smoking, they actually put the pill on the foil and then heat it. And so seeing foil with residue would obviously be a pretty concerning finding that there's drug use going on. Vaping is also really interesting. Oops, next slide, please. We just briefly wanted to discuss vaping kind of on the greater topic of substance use in teens, because the vape market has really made everything look like a USB drive. I see some nods, so folks seem to be pretty familiar with that. We just did one with CSET High School, a parent university, on vaping. And it's really interesting just how, now vaping is a lot of the disposable vapes are colorful. They're like gummy bear flavors. It really seems to be designed to catch the attention of our youth with exciting sounding colors and flavors. And just, it's one of those things that, again, on the upper right there, that's Juul. That's one of the more popular brands next to a USB drive. And it actually charges via USB. So it can look like it's a little wireless extender on your laptop when you're actually charging your Juul. Next slide, please. The other thing I think we wanted to bring up, just kind of as parents, as friends, as colleagues, it's really easy to hide substances. So this is a website that is designed to give you a picture, and you're supposed to figure out how many of the items in the photo are related to drug use. Next slide, please. And this is actually a public website called Power to the Parent, but they actually go through and talk about why dryer sheets are there, or it's a fake bottom shaving cream can, or what are the references in the art and the colors. So just if you're ever wondering about a friend or a colleague or your child, this kind of be a good place to start to look for some of the more subtler signs that your child or colleague or loved one is developing an interest in drug use. So I think it's something that, I think we all know the easy stuff, like finding a syringe would be pretty big deal. But some of the more subtle stuff is actually very interesting. Like dryer sheets, for example, can be used to mask the smell of drugs. Next slide, please.
So people oftentimes ask what would be the tip off that there's a problem. And these are some things we talk about, is really a change. Maybe a change in mood, maybe a change in their sleep, missing some responsibilities, unexpected irritability, anger, something that just doesn't fit, in my opinion, is something that you should at least consider what the cause is. It can be a number of things, but obviously substances are a concern. Obviously changes in hygiene. We note a lot that unfortunately some of our patients with substance use have to wear different kinds of clothing to cover skin signs. And so just keeping in mind something that I call it my radar, something that just tells you, wait, that doesn't make any sense. Listen, to what you're hearing.
Next slide, please.
So there are a number of new drugs on the market. I have learned so much in the last few years as we follow the overdoses, and someone will come into the ER with an OD that makes no sense. And we work with our toxicology, our forensics team in San Francisco. And so I'll send specimens, I'm like, what is it? And the first time I got a novel substance, the gentleman I was chatting with, he goes, grab a pen and sit down. Okay, so I did. And that was the first time I was introduced to Atizolam in our community. And that's a synthetic benzodiazepine. So it's a sedative like Xanax or like Klonopin or
Valium is usually the best well known.
Ativan. But it, again, has no legal US use. And it was slipped into a counterfeit powder substance, whatever we were using at the time. And unfortunately, that was a nearly fatal overdose. I'm grateful he was able to get to medical attention early enough. But so we're finding, in fact, just in February, acryl fentanyl is in this community. It is here. Acryl fentanyl, I'd never heard of it until I actually saw the mass spectrometer show me what it is. And so it's one of those things. Fortunately, our lab is able to detect acryl fentanyl when we're looking on the fentanyl screen, but knowing what's in our community is really important. And so we're trying to do some surveillance just so we can tell people what we're up against.
Next slide, please. So, and I think, again, it's also important to realize that in 2022, drug dealing is probably not what you think it is, which means it's on WhatsApp, it's via text message. Technology has really changed the game. As I mentioned, people can buy research chemicals online that are technically not illegal because they're for research. We had one lady buy and got like next day a highly addictive substance. She bought as a liquid as a research chemical on a website, and it came next day. As I mentioned, kind of the U.S. Postal Service is unwittingly becoming a major distributor because people are buying and selling on the internet. Talking to our teens, they know that you can get drugs on WhatsApp, on Snapchat. It's unfortunately so easy. These things, as much as they connect us in bad ways too. So it's unfortunately just it's very different than if you had to go somewhere and make a deal. A lot of it's being delivered. And if you think about it, depending on how much someone plans, they can easily say they're taking the garbage out and who knows who they're picking something up from. So it's a very kind of unsettling feeling as a parent to know just how easy that is. Next slide, please.
We get asked this all the time. Why would somebody use this? Why? And there's a number of reasons. Somebody may be intending to use something else and fentanyl was just added to the mix. And that's why I call it a poisoning. That's why I mentioned that, is I consider these poisonings. Regardless of intent, with what is in our street supply, that to me is a poisoning. So they may be intending to do something totally different or a different quantity for a different effect. They may be dependent or addicted. And honestly, when you talk to people that are suffering with addiction or that are dependent, that risk of death isn't considered a big enough risk, because withdrawal and those associated just horrendous feelings, unfortunately, like Casey said, it's fight or flight. They may be trying to change the way they feel. We talk about it. Am I using to feel good or am I using to feel better? So hopelessness, anxiety, fear, untreated or undiagnosed depression, especially now with COVID and what the isolation that our society has gone through, they may be taking it just to feel something different. And so reaching out before that event with knowledge and with support, we say oftentimes the opposite of addiction is connection. It's letting somebody know that you care and what matters to you matters to them. And then considering, we stopped asking the question, what's wrong with you? Why would you use drugs? It's what happened to you. Why are we in this situation where that is a viable choice, knowing the risks? Why? How can we help? And that's actually how we look at it with Prescribe Safe and why we've really done a multimodal outreach.
Yeah, I think the best way I can say it is, each one of these people who has a problem with drugs or alcohol or has an overdose has a story, right? If we go down to Robert Down and we ask the fifth graders, who wants to be a police officer when they grow up? Who wants to be a teacher? Who wants to be addicted and living in a tent in Chinatown? There are no takers in that age group. So there's always a story. And it helps me a lot in my practice to say, what happened to you, to understand that there's always a why and a story. Next slide, please. All right. So we've presented some not very good news. Frankly, the fentanyl situation is very scary, but kind of there's 5 things that we can do as a community. And then we're going to pivot to answering some questions. So you're here for number 1, get informed, right? It's so hard to understand what to do about a problem if you don't really understand the problem. The other thing is, if you're concerned about someone, you have to ask. And the best way to do it is if you can at a time when it's not stressful, a person's not in withdrawal, there's not a disciplinary, action pending. It's to keep it as non-judgmental and just objective of like, I'm concerned about you. Can we talk? And it can be really hard. And the addicted brain it just works so differently. And it can be just horribly frustrating when you're trying to express to someone that you care about them. And so being persistent, and to Dr. Close's point, remind them that you care and remind them that you support them, even if they're in a bad place. Reduce risk around the house. As you saw, I was in a sling for that video. I just had shoulder surgery. If you do need medications at home that could potentially be risky, lock them up. Get a prescription drug safe, know where they are. Same thing with alcohol. Obviously we know teens have been drinking alcohol for centuries. So if you have alcohol in your home, make sure it's in a secured place. And then tonight, you'll all get a dose of naloxone if you'd like one. For the folks on Zoom, we can leave some with the school that they can pick up, or we can go to one of the resources that we provided. Carry with you. I always joke, we're responsible homeowners, but we still have a fire extinguisher. There can always be an unexpected accident. And the last thing you want is not being prepared when you have 5 minutes to save someone in front of you. And then next slide, please. Know your resources. We have worked so much with Montage Health to put resources online. We are constantly trying to get more access to treatment, more access to naloxone. The other part of it is that, and we don't talk about it in this specific setting here, but we have tried so hard to get increased access to addiction treatment. When I first came to CHOMP, I'll never forget, I had a dad look me in the eye and say, my son's addicted to cocaine and you can't do anything about it. And I had to say, I'm sorry. And that's totally different. We now have a drug and alcohol counselor in our ear at CHOMP. Salinas Valley has 2 social workers that are trained in substance use that are in their emergency department. Natividad has a drug and alcohol counselor as well. We're trying to make treatment more accessible. All right, we always talk too much, so sorry. Next slide, please. All right, I think with that, we'll open it up to questions. Go ahead.
Before we go to questions, I have asked my friend, Michelle, to share with you and with our Zoom teammates her experience. It doesn't have to, you don't have to, whatever you're comfortable with, but I'm hoping that we can come together and understand better.
Well, good evening, everyone. My son left this world May 5th. Cinco de, that holiday is now means something totally different to me. May 5th, 2020. His drug dealer drove to our house at 3 a.m. in the morning. And I didn't know. I found him laying there. He was not breathing. Called 911. I tried to do CPR, but he wasn't breathing. He was blue. They came. They gave him 8 of those. 8. They did bring him back to life so that they could harvest his organs. He saved 5 lives that day. We've heard from all 5 of them. He's saved a 14-year-old. He has his heart, and he's reached out to us, so I hope that I get to hear his heart beating in his chest. He was a great kid. He was loved by so many. It happens it can just happen. You know, he'd only been doing that for less than a month. He was prescribed opioids for a ski accident, and we ran out of that, and he went to the dealer, and the dealer even said, oh yeah, I knew that those drugs had fentanyl in it because I had to administer Narcan to myself. But he went ahead and gave my son that pill that he knew that was probably going to kill him. There's nothing out there. All pills that are being sold by a drug dealer have fentanyl in it, and they are poisoning. They're not causing overdoses. This is poisoning, just like back in 1982, when someone went around and put cyanide in Tylenol. They called those murders. I think all of these are. Anyway, that's what I have to say about that.
It was important to me, mom to mom. It's important that we listen and we realize how this can affect our community and our own homes. So thank you. Michelle is so brave and I'm so grateful. I know we have a lot of questions, and then I want to make sure just regarding the resources that we brought here. So we have resources in Spanish, we have resources in English. We've come up with just kind of a lay person's guide to substances, what they do in the body, what to look for, why you would care. We also have the Good Samaritan information in card form, so you can share it with friends. The substance use services that are in this community. Again, creativity on someone's part of being able to make these trifolds. And then information on fentanyl and a quick cheat sheet on how to do Narcan. You'll have access, obviously, to all the videos. Our cards are here. Our substance use navigator, who understands the resources better than really anyone in the community. This is her job, is to help people connect to services. Her cards are here as well. So we have them in both English and Spanish, and then obviously we'll make sure that if you would like a dose of Narcan, it's here. Yes.
How would children reach out for one of these resources? My grandson is in an outpatient. At the outpatient program on Friday, and he died on Sunday. So I'd like to know if these resources will gain momentum in making sure that the children who are in these outpatient programs get them up. I think that that's important. I think that that's one step that we can take for educating our children. I left my home feeling like these children who have addiction are going to see this and be like, oh, well, all I need is this Narcan and I can keep doing my fentanyl.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking earlier about making sure Narcan's on campus. I think I see Narcan as one step in the process of getting people into recovery. The phenomenon that you just described is when someone uses a drug regularly, their body gets used to it. People often know it with alcohol, right? You know, if you drink a lot, you can hold your liquor, right? Same thing with opioids. But when a person's been in treatment, they lose that tolerance. And so right after actually leaving the prison setting or the criminal justice setting, or after a treatment program, that tolerance is gone. That's one of the most risky times if a person does relapse, that they can have a fatal overdose. So I'm trying to think, doesn't one of our programs give out Narcan at discharge? If not, we should fix that.
Right, and we've been working on it with the jail and then with the programs as well. Yeah, please.
Yes, I do have something to say about that. So when my son was using just for a very short period of time and going to that dealer, he instantly became way more addicted. Like he was so addicted to it. So he had the prescription, then he went to the dealer, and then as soon as he got the stuff from the dealer, that's when he was hooked. And then his father would find him, and I have pictures of him just passed out, and he looked like he was dead, but he survived it. So he built up a tolerance. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we put him in a rehab center, and he got out of rehab on May 4th. And May 5th at 3:30, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Xavier drove to the house and gave him his last pill, and he didn't have the tolerance.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think also another time to consider, distributing Narcan would be after a person's been in the criminal justice setting to prevent this. And then I think that unfortunately also comes down to the fact that, we as community members really need to arm ourselves with this. We work personally with all of our local treatment programs. And I think, a graduation dose of naloxone sounds like a pretty good idea. Do you want to moderate questions?
Yeah, most of the questions were answered throughout your presentation. One of the questions had to deal with what might be some of the reactions after Narcan is given to a patient. So say you are a youngster or a parent or a neighbor or a coach, a bus driver, and you administer Narcan. What can you expect the behaviors to be when somebody comes back?
That's an awesome question. Thank you for asking. So in the hospital, when we give intravenous Narcan, people wake up quickly. It is literally the rise from a dead thing. It's incredible to watch as a clinician. The nasal doses are different. I mean, I've followed now hundreds of reversals in one way or another. And people will slowly start to breathe a little more. It's less rapid absorption. And so it's not that wake up, basically an immediate withdrawal. Because that's obviously what someone's feeling. If you reverse them, is many of those people that are dependent or addicted, the dependency causes them to go into withdrawal. The nausea, vomiting, anger, frustration, all of those things. We just don't see it to that level with the nasal doses. But that's the other reason to call 911, right? Is those are trained professionals. They have dealt with as much precipitated withdrawals, one of the words we use for it, as we have in the ER. And so they know what to do. Obviously, keep yourself safe so you can help the person if they need something else, but we're just not seeing that rapid reversal.
Yes, I have a question.
So that the people at home can hear. Okay. We'll just pass mod.
They're asking.
Yeah, they're.
Okay, thank you so much. I forgot all about that. Thank you. It's great to be here. I think this is a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate the two doctors giving us a really medical, therapeutic presentation, warnings, treatments, the effects, and a lot of information along the medical line. Now, my question would be, I've heard the name fentanyl. I was watching a presentation by Senator Portman in Washington, D.C. He's involved in Homeland Security. He mentioned that the fentanyl is manufactured in China. This is all new to me. So is this anything you're aware of? And then it's smuggled into the country through an open southern border. Now, is this part of the problem that needs more addressing? I mean, great, somebody's affected by fentanyl. Now we know we can save them. But why, not just psychologically, why are they using? How is this so accessible? Just in the last few years, I used to hear about pot and cocaine.
Sure.
Now we're dealing with fentanyl. Who manufactures it? Where's it coming from? Can't we do something to stop the access to this drug? That's my question to you.
So there's a couple of, there's a lot of points there. So the first thing is I was trying to look up, there's a great book I just finished on this. I think it's called Fentanyl Incorporated, Fentanyl INC. So fentanyl is used legally. Up at Chomp, if someone has a severe pain, I might use fentanyl to treat them. So in some ways it's hard because the chemicals used to make a legal substance are not necessarily in and of themselves illegal. Okay. That being said, there are the number of kind of labs producing fentanyl are increasing. There are some in China. There are some in other countries as well. But the other point is that, the fact that a sugar packet worth of fentanyl can create 28,000 doses, and most of it's getting sent through the mail. And interestingly, I just finished another book on this topic called Overdose. It's about fentanyl in Canada. And in the port of Vancouver, they cannot screen that many letters, given the millions of letters they get per day. So I think what's hard is we can try to stamp out the supply, but it constantly changes. So with fentanyl, if you add an acetyl group, you get acetylfentanyl. If you add a floral group, you can get parafluorylfentanyl. And so in some ways, these drugs are being made and created before we even know to make them illegal, and they're potent enough that they can be sent through the mail. So it's just a different drug market. As an example, in Mexico, we in California get most of our drugs from the Sinaloa cartel. opium poppy fields are going fallow because it's more labor intensive to make drugs the traditional way. So it is simply, people are following what is the simplest, easiest way to get drugs into users' hands. The other thing is we have to consider demand, right? So there was a study in 1999 that looked at by the Rand Corporation that said, if you spend $1 million, what's going to prevent the greatest amount of drugs getting into your community? The answer, by at least 2 to 1 over any other intervention, was drug treatment. And so what's interesting is, why do people bring fentanyl here? Because we buy it, right? And unfortunately, the fentanyl is so easy to make. And I mentioned we see 65,000 tablets of fentanyl in Salinas 2 months ago. I think this idea from a law enforcement perspective of we can arrest our way out of this has not shown to work. We obviously, I can see Chief Nieto up there on the screen. We obviously work with law enforcement a ton, and there's a huge amount of benefit that law enforcement can provide by providing consequences when people don't get into treatment. But just as much as if, Superintendent Porras couldn't come to work, PG Unified doesn't close down, the organization continues. And that's really what it's been with drug cartels and kind of the trafficking market, is there's so much money in it because there's demand that no matter who we arrest or who we lock down, there will still be that demand, and therefore there will be profit to be made. I mean, it's just unbelievable if you think about it, just how much is this stuff being sold for on the streets? It is pennies to make and thousands to sell. The market is so kind of lucrative that people are constantly drawn to it. So that's a kind of a complicated answer. I don't know if I answered your question. That was good? Okay.
I just wanted to share that my daughter passed away 4 months ago from a fentanyl poisoning. And kind of to his point, I mean, just starting to become educated with it, because I didn't know, I didn't know anything about this. You hear about it, but until it comes to your door, then you start to understand what's going on. But it's like, to me, talking to other parents and getting to know how this happens. And obviously my heart goes out to these parents here who've gone through what we've been through. Narcan didn't work. Test strips don't work. Everything is just prolonging death. We're going to treatment centers. They're being Narcan back to life 3 months before, dying 3 months later. And kind of, to me, the bigger issue, and I know this might not be the forum for it, is, these people are selling pills, kids are dying, and they walk away with zero consequence. It's murder, and it's legal. And until there starts to be more of a crackdown on punishment, not shaming our children who are victims, making them out to be drug addicts and making them out to be ODs, and they're not. They're killings. And the individual who killed my daughter is, he's not going to jail for it. He's not being punished for it. And there's several people that they have killed, 3, 4 of them I know in Santa Cruz. Nothing's being done at that level. So as much as I appreciate having Narcan, having testers, 16-year-olds aren't going to test their drugs. They're going to just go use it. And, and then they can Narcan them back, and then they feel invincible. 2 months later, they're going to go again and again. So until there's more of a crackdown on the legal side of things, with it coming across the border, with at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, it's sad to see this is the number one killer in our country. And this is how many people we have here. It's killing on a huge scale. There's nothing said at the federal level. There's very little at the state level. We've got, 40 people here, and there just needs to be more. I appreciate the awareness, and I appreciate obviously the precautions we need to take, but there's, bigger measures that need to be done, because this is killing a lot of people.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for a well done presentation. I also wanted to add, I did lose my son a year ago, September of 2020. He did not have substance abuse disorder of any kind. He was a very good person in the community. We came from the neighboring community in Santa Cruz County when I heard that there was this town hall. I'm also a teacher. So I'm more aware now than ever. This wasn't on my radar at all, the word fentanyl. I had zero education on it. But to add on top of addiction and that avenue that is happening in our communities across the United States, there is experimentation, as we know young people will do. And fentanyl pills are, well, sorry, let me step back. There is Adderall, fake Valium, fake Oxycontin, fake Percocet, and fake Xanax in our communities, where kids and young people and adults for that matter think they're taking a name brand medication. And ultimately everybody deserves to be educated and they deserve to be able to be informed to make a choice. My son would have had in no way harmed himself, let alone a fly on the wall. And what my son thought he was taking, sadly, was a half of Percocet, and which he shouldn't have been doing, but he also did not deserve to die from his mistake. So people deserve to learn from their mistakes and not die from them. And sadly, in my case, it is wrongful death what happened to my son. He was with somebody who could have helped him. And there was a whole timeline of events where the person made conscious decisions to not help my son. And in fact, his father was home in the sharing the same bedroom wall where my son was struggling. And my son was supposed to be at work the next day. He worked full-time, he worked overtime. But my point is going back to the fact that people deserve to be educated. I listened to it was a year ago in the spring, OC Sheriff Barnes, Orange County Sheriff Barnes, he's doing a lot to educate in Southern California and beyond. There's a law right now that just failed to pass again, which is Alexandra's law, SB 350. You can look that one up. It didn't pass. There was one California state senator in favor of it. And that law is in favor of basically a progression, like kind of like a DUI on the first one. Somebody who is selling fentanyl would be, I don't know exactly how the strikes would work, but it was some progression towards holding somebody accountable for murder. So education is key, and there is many different organizations, of course, nonprofits. We met because we're in the same boat in the same county. So many parents and families are now trying to join forces and going to their local level and beyond. But there is a organization called songforcharlie.org, and they are putting a lot of information out there that is needs to be in our school systems and so on. And then lastly, want to add, when I was listening to that talk where they were trying to pass SB 350 last year, sorry, my grief brain goes away. Oh man. Oh, if it comes back to me, I'll just try and back in. Sorry about that. Yeah.
No,
Anyway.
and our experience in the emergency department is yours, that these are kids trying something for the first time and they don't have a chance. And it's so unfortunate because, the adolescent brain has a very unique position in that it is more emotional and less rational because of how the brain is growing. And there's always, an interesting experimentation. I'm currently reading, sorry, you guys are hearing about all my books. I'm currently reading a book about childhood development. It turns out 14 is one of the most impulsive ages. And it's just so hard because there's this desire to experiment and it's just not even fair. They're not even getting addicted. They're just overdosing. So we hear exactly what you say because we see it when we go to work. I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
And then to clarify, poisoning.
Thank you.
Because a half of a name brand medication isn't lethal. No. And I guess I'll add this as well. There are police, military, as well as college journal articles on chemical warfare. And that's a whole other thing, but it is something worth investigating because this is a huge problem across the nation. So thank you.
Just want to do a quick time check. I know.
Yeah, I wanted to just reiterate. One of the questions that was in the chat is, what are you doing to help educate our children at the school level about fentanyl and Narcan? It's every one of us, right? We're going to share this presentation on our district website and on our school websites, and we're going to talk about it, and parents need to talk about it, and we need to continue the relationships that we have with local law enforcement and mental health experts to provide our students the services that they need and provide the information. This should be conversations at dinner. This should be conversations when you got your kid in the car for an hour and there's nothing to do, you talk about it. And it is an epidemic right now. I mean, the slide alone of the Monterey Peninsula with the blue and yellow and red dots had me designing this town hall the next second. You know, I was calling Monterey Peninsula Unified to see what they were doing and Carmel to see what they were doing. And I was just hearing about how our kids are affected every day. It's too much. And so it's meetings like this, it's town halls like this, it's coming together, parents, teachers, administrators, law enforcement, mental health experts, all coming together to talk about this with our children.
I think that is really underreported deaths. I mean, my daughter's not listed as a fentanyl overdose. She had cocaine in her system. Probably the fentanyl came through, and she's listed as an OD. I mean, it's under, and she's only 16. So it's way under what you're seeing with Dodgers fight double.
And as far as the distribution of Narcan, I know that Dr. Grover and Dr. Close brought some with them tonight. We're going to work hard to increase those amounts and get them on the lanyard of anybody who's around our students as much as they are. Some districts have them on their lanyards on bus drivers, on coaches, you know, in the hands of the people who need it.
Thank you. While your stories are just tragic and touching at the same time, and I'm so grateful that Pacific Grove and Monterey County is finally talking about this. My question, I have a question and then something else to add, is what is CHOMP, what is Santa Cruz, what is the county doing with our doctors and our dentists? I know, teenagers get their wisdom teeth out, and overprescription is a huge problem. I do know that. So what is happening in that regard? Because like with your son. And then secondly, as long as also the parents know or the guardians know that take their kids in to guide their doctors about overprescribing. They are the ones to say, hey, let's try here, let's try low, and then go high. That's my point.
So it's a great question. So there's not actually one US opiate epidemic, there's three. So the first one was truly the overprescribing by doctors. And that's actually how this started. Prescribe Safe was don't overprescribe, prescribe safely. Unfortunately, because of the phenomenon of opioid dependence, if a person takes opioids regularly and stops, they get withdrawal. And we as doctors told people, you have a problem, you need to stop, and didn't account for their withdrawal. So people found illicit opioids, most specifically heroin, and that was wave 2. And wave 3 now is the arrival of the synthetic opioids, or so-called fentanyl. So to answer your question, what's CHOMP doing? I can say we are now one of 5 hospitals in the country that have a designation called Pain and Addiction Certified Emergency Department, where we have safe access to pain treatments that are not involving opioids. And we also, there's a gold, silver, and bronze level. We got it at gold. There are only 3 other hospitals in the country with that designation, and one of the others is Harvard. So we've put in work over the last 10 years trying to come up with ways that we can treat without using opioids. So for example, if you get a kidney stone, there are so many great options for kidney stone pain that don't involve opioids. We're trying to develop like a nerve block program. You saw me in my sling. I got a nerve block after surgery. I had no pain for 3 days. And we're trying to be able to do that for the inpatient setting. My grandmother fell in PG at Canterbury Woods, and one of my colleagues relocated her shoulder with a nerve block and no other medication. So I think from the physician standpoint, unfortunately, now what we're struggling with is to get doctors to start taking care of addiction patients. Unfortunately, stigma is a huge issue, and it makes doctors not want to take care of those patients. And there's an interesting quirk in US law that in order to prescribe medications to get someone off opioids, you need a special certification. It's called the X waiver. And it used to be you had to take 8 hours of coursework. It's now actually better. And so doctors on duty, every doctor's on duty has a doctor with this waiver. In our emergency department, about 90% have their waiver. And at Salinas Valley, they're creating a little friendly competition among the doctors as to which hospital group can get it done first. So your point is exceedingly well taken. And I think we personally, when we see a colleague prescribe an opioid to someone who's a teenager, what are you doing? It's just, there's got to be better ways to do it. And I empower all of you as patients or advocates for your loved ones to ask the doctor a question. Is this appropriate? Absolutely ask that question. Do we have time for one more?
We do for over here, but I do want to, I've gotten a lot of comments. It says we've got over 200 people online. Don't forget about us. So I do want everyone's question answered. So if it would be okay, and we are running over, and thank you everybody for your, it is most, we're going to stay. We're going to answer your questions. For the people who are in the chat, I'm going to take all of your questions and answer them and provide them on our district website should we not get to them today, but I want you to know that all of your questions will be answered. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to know if, what is your suggestion for a person that's using and they're all alone, or they're with someone that's also using? I mean, it's a tough situation.
There's a website called don'tdie.org, truly, and you call before you use, and you say, I'm going to use heroin. They'll ask you a few demographics, ask you where you are, basically, and then you use your substance of choice. And if you stop responding to them, they will call 911 and send them to your location. Yeah.
You know, I'm 75 years old, and this isn't the first time I've heard these songs and dances about, you guys are doing a great job. Not here to insult you, but we're not dealing with the people that are giving these drugs out properly, okay? And that is our issue. These people that cause the deaths of these young people should be put to sleep themselves, okay? And until we start realizing how important that is, it's never gonna stop. We're just another generation, and the next generation is gonna have drugs again, and the next generation. I'm a Vietnam vet that was wounded. I was in the Palo Alto emergency room. They started a program now of no pain. That was a few years ago. You know, every time they saw you, they say, what's your pain level? What's your pain level? And then they whacked you out if you wanted it. I mean, you know, come on. The drug companies are making tons and tons of money. Let's not keep blaming the kids, these 11-year-old, 12-year-old kids for being, you know, well, there's a demand for it. You know, they're addicted purposely by drug dealers who are not nice people, you know, and that's what we need. We got to start hitting them back. If we keep doing this nonsense and letting somebody get away with the death of a 14-year-old, come on. So I think we had enough of this.
So I think that's where I say that we really like working with law enforcement, because I think as a medical provider, I think of medical treatment, but law enforcement has the power to change incentives. And so, you know, I think in some ways there has not been a lot of collaboration between doctors and law enforcement. I'm proud to say here in this county, we work very closely with our law enforcement colleagues. And I agree. I think demand, we can work from the medical side with treatment and prevention, but I absolutely agree. You know, if a child has a poisoning, there should be consequences.
From the chat, does Monterey County have any overdose prevention centers?
I am not aware of one. I think our overdose prevention has been person to person with naloxone. Obviously, if you call 911, we do have a, you know, that will respond, and the police do carry Narcan. And, you know, I think that's really where we're at.
Well, we have our syringe services programs that, you know, they distribute fentanyl test strips, as was mentioned. And that's not something we brought up today because it depends on which part of the substance you test, whether or not that has fentanyl positive or negative doesn't tell you, is it a lethal dose? So that's why I didn't actually mention it, is I don't, it's a tool, but there's a lot more to it. But as far as you know, there is talk about safe injection sites or safe use sites. I don't know if that's what the person is referencing, but there are some services in the county, but, you know, obviously there's not a safe use site or something such as that.
Thank you.
Go ahead, ma'am.
My concern tonight is that I come here and there's one child here getting some information. Yep. And I'm concerned about how many times are these kids exposed to this information for their own health and well-being.
Yeah. So great question. I came to PG High pre-COVID in 2019 and spoke to, in fact, the whole high school. I have a talk that I put together. I gave it at Carmel High last week. I'm going to do some education at Central Coast High. I agree, you know, and what's really challenging is we all have adult brains and they have growing brains. And so what we are motivated by is not always what they are motivated by. And we are working really to try to improve how relatable the information is. And in some ways, some of these kids aren't afraid of death. If you tell them you could die, they're like, I don't care. And I don't really know if I know what to do with that yet. So I think in some ways we're working to figure out how best to make the education stick for that age group. Go ahead.
I just have a piece of that question. Is what about putting kids who get educated into those programs to lead these classes? That brain is functioning like that brain.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about kids getting being the representatives, basically, along with parental or whoever, to help that situation. But I'm thinking that these kids, they're not dumb.
Right. So we just got a grant with the CDC called Drug-Free Communities. We're partnering with Monterey Peninsula Unified with plans to share kind of what we develop. But yeah, Pajaro Valley up to the north actually had the same grant, and they created kind of a peer mentoring program. Mm-hmm. So we just hired a social worker essentially with Ohana, that's Montage's youth mental health program, to work in the schools to really customize the education. I apologize. Speaking of parenting, one of us has to go pick up the kid.
I realize we're in the interest of time here. I don't mean to open a can of worms. If I could speak with either of you, Dr. Close or Dr. Grover, after the meeting, a little bit about the administration of Narcan while a patient, while a client, while a recovering addict perhaps is on Suboxone or Subutex, and the effects of which, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no problem.
But what I'd like to say is a little solution-based, if some. I think that as far as a community, we're down, I think, in 2021. Extremely well spiked down is what I saw. I don't know what the current trends look like. I'm sorry for everybody's loss here in the room today. I think there are some solutions. I think they're recovery based. I think it's about knowing what's going on with your child and then feeling like you have the resources to impact their life in some way, and that be an intervention, perhaps, sort of way. And I don't know if the invitation there to recovery is even always the best answer or remedy, because sometimes they get more introduced to things, and they there's like a herd mentality of things going on for kids these days. And while it's very experimental for kids, the risk stuff that they're doing, the prepubescent brain of a male teenage brain is going. I would not be here today if this stuff was loose in my community. I grew up right here on Fountain Avenue, and that being said, I think that because kids are seeking risk, and they associate this behavior, this behavior is that they don't have a whole bunch of there's a whole bunch of other things you can do for your kid, any athletic league, anything risky at all. Even some of the arguments that happen at home at this age are indicative of that development, I think, in the brain, that biological marker in the brain. Really placing something at that level, I think, as a prevention is necessary. Now, intervention, though, I'd like to be able to speak at some level as well with you, if possible, about the housing here in the community, whether it be aftercare. I know that's an issue. The coalition, HRC, and everything kind of is somewhat crippled in some sense. But we have so many top-heavy, and I mean this in the most earnest way. There are people that have been deeply affected in this community, and there are homeowners, and there are people that would like to help. And there are, I myself am familiar with a program that has recently just opened in Monterey. It looks at from the level of what I've seen here on the screen, is that they are, we're dealing right here in the lower horseshoe of our peninsula, some of our PG, Carmel, and then Monterey children is really what they are. And I do agree with Dr. Close as it being a poison. I think that's a different track to take. But what I do think in this as a solution is that housing really need to get remedied. I don't know if there's perhaps some kind of real estate syndicate where mutual investors could come together, but I do know from the ground level that I'm familiar with a sober living home, which is oftentimes aftercare, after intervention has taken place. You can monitor kids at that level. I don't know if there could be something but I know for the reentry contract for prison, and it's a GO contract is what it's called. When people get out of prison, they require that there's somebody there to enter in the management system, the arms management system. They're requiring that to gain that contract, to have that contract, they're mandating that somebody be on the premises at all times. There's another contract at ASN that is responsible for some of the opiate prevention. I guess they're helping with Suboxone. I think they're almost exclusively in their Monterey now. I imagine, right? They're doing some big stuff, Narcan training as well. What they're doing, I believe, is they're putting people in hotel rooms where they're not being monitored. And if some program like that were to exist for when we see a spike at the very least, and we're down in trend, it looks like, but if we did see a spike, if there was something loose in the community that was ultra poisonous, ultra critical in our trends, we do know that, I think, at some level through law enforcement. I think something could be done at that point. It'd be a more critical, well-placed, where we could pull the trigger. We had beds available. We had luxury sober living homes is what it is that I'm affiliated with some. And it's just been a remarkable endeavor in some ways. There's a little bit of an issue, I believe, if you don't mind me embellishing on that some, with respect to the sober living communities. It really takes monitoring and test kits. I was going to ask you if you would have test kits. We have Narcan. We are welcoming the training there at the sober livings, and what we really need is more sober livings and monitoring on the sober living premises. And if you can catch this through an intervention standpoint, and perhaps even like a youth program sort of a sober living, because you wouldn't want to mix 14-year-olds with 20-year-old parolees. You definitely, I don't think that's going to be the best solution. Exactly, it might be the first thing that we see. But I don't think it's where we're needing to go. There's a Hep C and an HIV thing, and that's a different contract. There's a reentry, and that's a different contract. And what I'm associated with in some ways, I'm gaining some proximity to is that the best modality, I think, of treatment isn't even under a umbrella of a contract. It's for people who are engaged in the community, they're working, they're in school, they're in athletic leagues, if it were a youth program, and those people have a dignity embedded in the program. You can't just give a person funding for 4 to 6 months and Suboxone and expect relapse not to occur. You have to bring the health care of that dignity, I think, to the table. So that is what's happening at the sober living that I'm talking about. We would love to have a lot more of the contract money, if you would, but the actual traction, I think, is when people are paying their way a little bit and they're given some of those things. And that monitoring could then be somewhat indicative then of those developments in a person's life, whether it just be athletic leagues, after school programs, things like this, if it really was the youth, and then more housing, more resources. If we did ever see a trend, we were prepared. And just as in closing, I think that there's been some, we didn't foresee this, I don't imagine, but there was a huge Oxycontin trend and phase. I think that was phase 2. You may have mentioned, I'm not sure which it was, phase 1. And we got a hold of that. The problem is that some other stuff erupted up now, and it's a worse animal, is what it sounds like. And so I just think that more of those sober livings, I think, and things being so expensive here on the peninsula, if anyone would like to talk with me a little bit about the business ownership structure or something like that, just in very loosely, I'd be open to that.
Thank you, sir. Right behind you.
It came back to me. So, so according to that press conference I was listening, or anyway, with OC Sheriff Barnes, the first toxicology report west of the Mississippi was only 6 years ago. So this is a total paradigm shift where, again, education is going to be key. This needs to be get in our schools as soon as possible. And again, with every family that I have now met throughout California and beyond who's been affected, these are young kids that are dying at home, found alone in their beds or at their desks. These are not people, they think they're taking a Xanax or something that's very casual, that is not harmful. And again, education is going to be key. Fentanyl is, 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine. So it has to be in our school systems.
Thank you.
I'll be quick. You mentioned the program that is available now at CHOMP, the drug and prevention program.
We have a drug and alcohol counselor who works in our ER.
Okay. And what is the cost of that? I'd like to see some focus on our resources being readily available to those who have, not the means to pay for it.
So the person arrived in our hospital as a part of a grant from the state. There's a program called the California Bridge Project, and they basically, a number of emergency doctors like Rev and I said, we're seeing people with addiction and substance use. We have no resources. Can't we do a better job? And the answer is yes. So we hired, her name is Araceli. She's wonderful. She's been with us since 2019. And if someone comes in, the physicians will handle the medical side if they're in withdrawal, if they've got an infection, if they've had an overdose, if they've been poisoned with fentanyl. And then her job is to connect them with treatment programs. Sometimes people have to stay in the hospital until they can go to residential. Sometimes people find a faith-based program. The path to recovery from substance use and addiction is very different person to person. Oh,
my children, my grandchildren, the whole basketball team from PG Middle School is all sitting at home watching this right now. I wanted to bring you that comfort.
Yeah. So I mean, unfortunately, access to healthcare is a challenge for any condition. Addiction is unfortunately a condition that falls into that category. The gentleman there mentioned Access Support Network. They have free clinics for folks who are trying to get off of opioids. And then the Bridge Restoration Ministry here in PG is a faith-based program that takes people for free for a year. Youth. People in the room who've been here longer than I have may remember the Clint Eastwood program. I think Dave Deal's still here. We were talking about that recently, but Ohana Chomp just got that huge program, and they're building it out in Ryan Ranch, and the goal is to have a lot more services. That I don't know, unfortunately.
I've heard so many people with alcoholism who want help but can't afford to get themselves into treatment.
We do have some limited funds to sponsor people to get telemedicine, like they can see a doctor and prescribe medications over them using telehealth. But you've pointed out it is a very difficult problem. Sounds like we should pass out some Narcan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Grover. And
yeah, sorry, my wife is getting our child, so thank you.
Thank you, families who attended. We will be answering all of the questions that you have in the chat. I will have them typed out and posted on our district website for you. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to you. Thank you, everybody, so much for attending.